Good morning. I'm Brad Berkey, also with the Westmont in San Francisco program, and have the privilege, along with Karen, of being with all of you today and being part of a program that has engaged in transformation, helping students gain a deeper understanding of themselves, the world, their unique calling in the world. It's no secret that we live in difficult times, and difficult times require difficult conversations. And difficult conversations, particularly staying with difficult conversations, requires a courage, an honesty, and a humility that is in short supply these days, within society as well as the church, within the community of faith, within places like Westmont. And as Christians, we often struggle with how to engage in these difficult conversations, particularly around those difficult issues that divide us. Issues such as race, privilege, inequality, political, religious, and theological differences of all sorts. And paralyzed by fear, be it fear of conflict, fear of division, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of being misunderstood, we too often retreat, remain silent, or secretly wrestle with whether we really believe God is in control, and that His grace and that a biblical kingdom call to peace, to justice, to reconciliation, to the restoration of right relationship is really there to be had. Standing amidst these fears and apprehensions is Ken Wytsma, our Westmont and San Francisco chapel speaker this morning. Ken is one who represents a unique and I would say fresh and needed Christian voice amidst these difficult, divisive times. Ken is a scholar. His most recent book, The Myth of Equality, was recently named one of the top 5 religious books of 2017. He is also a theologian and a pastor, and one who has given himself head and heart to reflecting deeply about the issues that divide us along race, class, gender, and religious lines, and is one who has taken the risk to enter into those difficult conversations that many of us fear talking about honestly, talking about confessionally, and listening to carefully. Much of what makes Ken Wytsma unique is that he engages these difficult issues and difficult conversations out of a developed understanding of and recovery of justice, biblical justice, which notably he believes is not merely an add-on dimension of Christian faith, but what stands at the very center of God's heart, and hence the center of our spirituality, our spiritual formation, our pursuit of holiness. For me and many others who have known Ken and his writings, he is one who reminds us that we need to engage, to lean into life's difficult issues, life's difficult conversations and questions, life's messiness and the gospel call to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly, not simply because it's the right thing to do, but because, contrary to popular opinion and the ways of this world, it is the very space where we encounter God and where we encounter ourselves more fully, provided that we can trust that conflict is not end of relationship, and that there is no place where God is absent. So won't you join me with open hearts to hear what God might say to us this morning through our guest speaker, Ken Wytsma.
Thank you, Brad. That was one of the kindest, well-thought-through introductions I've ever had. I'm also glad my 4 daughters, who are ages 16 and down, weren't here. They laugh at every introduction of me that makes me seem different than their dad that sits around watching Netflix at night. So, how are you guys doing? I can't see anyone. I'm going to pretend I'm just talking to my ideal audience. Nobody also told me that it was summer down here. I left Oregon and it was winter, and all I have is sweaters, and I felt really silly walking around this morning at Starbucks and everyone's in short sleeves. I'm going to jump right in because I want to talk about some really weighty, important things, and I think we're going to have fun, and I think you'll like it. But it's really stemming from this conversation out of this book that I wrote called The Myth of Equality. It's the only book where I didn't come up with the idea myself. I was approached by InterVarsity Press to write this book. They asked if I would consider doing a book on race and privilege as somebody that's been a part of the justice conversations in the evangelical church for a number of years now, because these conversations aren't just supposed to be conversations on the edges or conversations that are happening in kind of urban settings or only where there are a lot of minorities present or only where certain topics that come into play with regard to race are being talked about. That this is really something that we need to bring into our gospel conversations. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that kind of as we go. That the center of how we understand Jesus and what it means to be in Christ, that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free person, male nor female, that in Christ we truly are one, that the divisions are erased, and that we have equality, that this is really foundational to all of our other conversations. And it's easy sometimes for the evangelical church to push some of this stuff to the periphery and to always ignore it. And that day is in some sense past, that we have to wrestle this through with kind of all that we're talking about. So it brings up this awkward phrase that we talked about last night, and I got a lot of questions on, this phrase called white privilege. And it's an interesting phrase because I once was approached by a chaplain of a Christian university in the Midwest, and he spent about a half hour on the phone with me asking me to mentor him or give him advice as to, I might have to get that other mic, as to this idea of privilege and how that should be factored into how he went about doing chapel at this Christian school, this Christian college. And at the end of it, he said, would you come out and speak at our college? And I said, well, this is actually a great thing. We could do a panel discussion and we could tackle that subject in chapel and really advance kind of the vocabulary and the understanding and move the ball forward with your students. And he says, no. Can you just come out and speak to our chapel? But I can't have you talk on that subject. And I was really confused because that's what we'd talked on for the last half hour. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, my boss, the new president of the school, has forbade that phrase ever be used from the stage of our chapel. That we can talk about anything we want, but that phrase can't come out of anyone's mouth. And I thought that was really interesting, and I thought it was really sad because as disciples, we are learners. That's actually what the Greek word disciple means. It just simply means learner. Plato had disciples, Aristotle had disciples, Jesus had disciples. Jesus was a rabbi or a teacher, and he taught the followers or the learners that came around him. And so as disciples, first and foremost, we are people who are receptive, open. Our soil, the soil of our hearts, is there to receive what God would teach us. And so we wrestle with ideas. We should be wrestling with deep concepts, and we should be creating environments or spaces where we can have the difficult or challenging conversations that we as the church need to have. And if we're not going to, at a Christian thinking institution, be willing to have deep or difficult conversations, then where as Christians are we going to have those? Does that make sense? So I want to kind of dive into this idea of why we're afraid, maybe in the majority kind of culture here, to have these difficult conversations. And it's partly because when we have a culture that has been set up where you have, in some sense, an aristocratic kind of vestige where there are class divisions, race divisions, gender divisions, socioeconomic divisions, not all of those based on what people have earned or worked for, but inherited as they've gone through, some of them through unjust systems and structures that have been historically at play. You have this interesting dynamic where some people are having their circumstances changed from the top, as other people from the bottom are working toward or fighting for equality. And that sets up this interesting fear dynamic in the majority culture. And that fear dynamic is cashed out in this phrase, where the loss of privilege often feels like oppression, but it's not. The loss of privilege often feels like oppression, but it's not. So is anyone watching The Crown? Is anyone here watch Netflix? The Crown? So I was watching it with my wife. My wife always wonders how these Netflix shows have anything to do with my career or our faith. And so every once in a while, I'll lift something from something we're watching and tell her, see this illustration. I needed this for Westmont Chapel. So in season 2 of The Crown, so just to set it up, this is basically the story of Queen Elizabeth from the time she kind of goes on tour right before her dad dies, following World War II, all the way up kind of till the present. And so as we're watching it in season 2, you're in the late 1950s, the early 1960s, and a lot is changing in the world. Kind of the British Empire is crumbling away in different kind of ways. They're losing their position or their place in the world, or they certainly feel that that's threatened. And this particular episode called Marionettes, the interesting thing that's set up is how much the monarchy is out of touch with the people of England, just the working class people, that the language of the monarchy and even the traditions of the monarchy are really detached. And so an MP or a journalist, if you will, someone that's looking, I'm sorry, for journalistic attention, kind of comes and critiques Queen Elizabeth. And as he does, he gets this kind of overwhelming support from the people in England, such that Queen Elizabeth finally agrees to have an unofficial audience with this person and say, so what are your opinions? What do you think I should do? And she's not wanting to be there. And he gives her 5 things. And one of them is, televise your Christmas address. Let the people come into your living room and see you, your family, as you kind of do this warm Christmas address. Become one with the people that way. And he goes kind of into a couple of other things, and then he says, and also this debutante's ball that you have. You only have highborn or aristocratic people come to that. You need to open that up and let debutantes, if you will, of different classes of society come into Buckingham Palace and be greeted by you as you kind of do this annual ball. And so she takes the first one and that other one as the 2 recommendations out of the 5 that she's going to do. And in this particular episode of The Crown, towards the end, they're getting ready to welcome the people coming for this ball. And she and her mother, the Queen Mum, so the older, I think it's Mary, so it's Elizabeth's mother, they're sitting at the window watching people get out of cars, and the Queen Mum is kind of lamenting that this is the butcher, this is the mechanic, these are those common people, and they're about to come in. And you can see that she's really angsty about this. And then she goes into this line, so I'll read it for you. She says, all this to open things up. And Queen Elizabeth says, yes. And then the Queen Mum says, to bring us more in line with the real world, to democratize us. And so it goes. The stings and the bites that we suffer as it slips away, bit by bit, piece by piece, our authority, our absolutism, our divine rights. The history of the monarchy in this country is a one-way street of humiliation, sacrifices, and concessions in order to survive. First, the barons came for us, then the merchants, now the journalists. Small wonder that we make such a fuss about our curtsies and protocol and precedent. It's all we have left. The last scraps of armor as we go from ruling to reigning to what? To nothing at all. Marionettes. And then she looks at her daughter and says, right, let's put on our gloves. And they put on their gloves because they're now going to touch all these hands and get all these germs. And they go out to greet the people. And I remember looking at that and I said, that's an amazing picture of someone that has experienced a lot of privilege and is unable to process how that privilege is slipping away. She's not being persecuted. There is no oppression. Other people are fighting for equality in this system, but she's ill-equipped, the Queen Mum, with a vocabulary or a language or a worldview or a gospel to deal with this change in society. So I want to give you two things that kind of come out of this book, The Myth of Equality, that I wrote, that really I think are important for us to deal with. And the first one has to do with a theological understanding of the gospel and then the practical outworking of the good news in society. So the first thing here is just the gospel. And I would say for a long time, we've had a flaw in our gospel. How for hundreds of years could Christians in the South go and be a part of lynchings on Friday and then give the sermon, if you will, on a Sunday morning because that individual's a deacon in the church? How could the most Christian nation, arguably, to exist in the modern world and the most Christian part of our country, the South, how could that gospel exist or coexist compartmentalized from the exploitation of other human beings made in the image of God for so long? What was it about their understanding of the good news that allowed that to sit just literally disconnected in their thinking and in their societies for so long, even till today? And I think the flaw in our gospel, and this is going to sound shocking, is that we've made too much of the cross. Now, Ben Patterson up here is sweating, and I swear this is going to go a very theological direction. But we've made too much of the cross by not including the other parts of the gospel. Colossians chapter 1, I'll read it for you. Now the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. And so here we go. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, that is Christ, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And then it says this beautiful thing. Once you were alienated far from God, and now you are able to come close because he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body. And then it goes on and says, this is the hope that we have held out in the gospel. So what is the gospel? The gospel is good news. News is a story. This story of good news is that a loving God, the creator of the world, has raised Jesus up, given him all authority, and sent Jesus into the world so that Jesus could reconcile a broken and lost world back to God. And he did this and accomplished this once and for all by his death on the cross. So, if I asked you in this story, what is the means? What is the means or the mechanism by which this good news is accomplished? What's the answer? A senior, maybe. What's the means? See, we don't really parse out the gospel enough to really understand all these different parts. But it's really obvious. It's said by his death on the cross. The cross is the means of our salvation, is it not? But the interesting thing is, if all you have is the means, you don't really understand the story. If I just said to you DMV, you don't really have much. If I said to you, my 16-year-old daughter, she just turned 16 2 months ago. If I said to you, my daughter on her 16th birthday went and got her driver's license by going to the DMV, now you have the story, don't you? That this awful thing, the DMV, played this wonderful part. It was the means, if you will, of liberating my 16-year-old daughter from the clutches of my driving, to set her free and bend, right? God, DMV, the cross. The cross is not a beautiful thing. It was a Roman torture device on which Jesus was killed, right? DMV. So that through that cross, God could set the world free, reconcile sinners back to himself, and just bring about the state of affairs for which God longed in his love when he sent Jesus. Does that make sense? So the means of the gospel is what? Somebody. The cross. The end of the gospel is what? The reconciliation of all things. That's why when Jesus died on the cross, it was not the altar that broke in two, because never again would there need to be a sacrifice. That was implied. What did happen was the temple veil was rent from top to bottom, symbolizing what the cross was meant to accomplish. The cross was the means, the rent veil was the ends, the reconciliation of all things. Now, I wrote an article recently for Outreach Magazine. Outreach Magazine is a pretty conservative, kind of gospel-focused magazine. And I talked about this flaw in our gospel. And I said, the problem is that we make too much of the cross. Not that we make too much of it as the ends, but that in not including the rest of the story, we force the cross to have to carry all the weight of the good news, which it's ill-equipped to do. In other words, it's the means. It cannot tell us the fullness of the story of the ends. And in doing this, if you read the comments, I was just lambasted. And my response would simply be, how am I injuring the means? How am I dishonoring the means? How am I doing a disservice to the means, to the cross, to talk about the end? Let me put it another way. When Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 said this, that if there was no resurrection, if Jesus did not bodily raise from the dead, if he did not come back, then we, the people that have our hope in Jesus, we're the most to be pitied of all people. Was Paul somehow doing a disservice to the cross? To only be talking about the resurrection? Was he somehow minimizing the role of the cross? He certainly wasn't. Paul was basically saying Jesus died on the cross for the forgiveness of sins, and then by raising from the dead on the third day, he stamps and seals and shows us that he truly did have the authority to forgive sins, and now give us this kind of look, this first look at what the resurrection is actually going to be or mean for us. And so that's why on Good Friday we walk out sad and we feel the weight of the cross, the weight of darkness, and on Easter morning, we come to do what? We come to celebrate. Hopefully more than just wear new clothes or pastels or whatever, right? We come on Easter morning to celebrate. Why? Because it is in some sense the finale of the good news. That Good Friday without Easter morning, Resurrection Sunday, is incomplete. The cross, without the reconciliation of all things, is an incomplete story. It's just a data point. When you back up and you say, God so loved the world that he sent Jesus to die on the cross so that we could have forgiveness of sins and be reconciled back to God. Now you have a circle, you have a complete loop, you have good news, you have the gospel. Now, why is that important? It's important because when we take just the cross, I think over hundreds of years, we've begun to create very tight language for the gospel. Very tight language that only theologians can fully get right. And we set it up and we protect it like the Mona Lisa behind bulletproof glass. And we create these groups that I call guardians of the gospel. And they're there to tell everyone how they're getting it wrong and to really protect the gospel. And I think in doing this, we lose the wild nature of good news. The wild nature of women running out of a garden who don't have theological language, who just know that it has happened, that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and that changes everything. That people would go out from the temple steps hearing the message from the apostles, and as they go out, they say, I don't know how to explain this to you fully, but come and hear these guys teach and preach. They're going to tell you of forgiveness. They're going to tell you of freedom. They're going to tell you of hope. That somehow a liberated people that finally hears, or an oppressed people or a subjugated people that finally hears of their liberation, you can't contain that. It bursts out and takes 100,000 different ways as people tell it from one person to the next. And it's wild, it's exciting, it's good news, it's viral, it's contagious. It's the kind of thing that takes a small sect from an area of the Roman Empire called Palestine, and within a couple hundred years makes it the dominant way of seeing the world as people continue to worship and celebrate God. It's the good news. And so this is really important that we understand both the means and the end, because when we understand that, we say things like race has no place in our gospel conversation. I've been told that as many times as I can count. Race has no place in our gospel conversation. In other words, this tight formula about kind of the cross, disconnected from the whole story of good news breaking into this world, this little tight formula doesn't really afford language or space to connect it to race or injustice or discrimination or prejudice or all of these other kinds of things. And I think, again, here's the practical outworking. When we understand the whole story of the gospel, it's a light. Jesus was the light of the world that's come in. He tells us to not hide our light under a bushel. He talks about a city on a hill cannot be hidden, that you can see it from a long ways away. It's the nature of light, no matter how small. If I just had even a lighter here on the stage, that somehow that light pierces the darkness and touches everything in the room. The gospel, the good news, the light, right? It pierces darkness and touches everything in the room. It therefore certainly must touch the greatest historic injustice of the last 500 years. Could we call it good news if it didn't have something to say to that? When Jesus was asked by John the Baptist, are you really the Messiah? He doesn't say yes. He says, go and tell John what? That broken things are being fixed, that bad things are being addressed, that people who need being set free are being set free, the people who need healing are being healed. In other words, he pointed to the fact that he actually was accomplishing the good news that was prophesied in Isaiah 61, in which he read from the Isaiah scroll at the beginning of his ministry. He was doing what he said he would do. He was accomplishing this good news, the beginning of this good news. So, why does this really matter? Because without it, we read Scripture with blinders. With it, we can see some very different things. I had a Latino pastor in his 70s from New York City teach me some theology lessons recently, just in conversation, that I had never gotten in all my years of seminary. So Acts 2, we know that the church is all together, and it's this beautiful picture of equality, is it not? But you go a couple chapters later, and all of a sudden you see that this kind of unravels, and it unravels why? Because the Greek-speaking widows are not getting the alms or not getting what they need in terms of kind of the sustenance to take care of them. That the charity of the church in Acts 2 actually wasn't reaching the people from a different culture, a different ethnicity, that spoke a different language and were vulnerable. It was breaking down along ethnic lines. Do you see that? And so how does the church, the early church, the apostles deal with this? They go and find somebody and appoint that person, Stephen, to oversee this and make sure that this is kind of happening and going to it. It's really interesting who they picked, which I never really thought about growing up. They picked Stephen. You know that Stephen's a Greek name? Stephanos? It's a Greek name. There was a problem with the Greek-speaking widows, and so they brought along a Greek person familiar with that culture, probably familiar with that language, and that obviously had a heart for what they were calling him to do. And so Stephen, with his Greek name, is helping these Greek-speaking widows, and all of a sudden runs into the same religious authorities that Jesus ran into and that Jesus' disciples had run into. Interestingly enough, those religious authorities had threatened to stone Jesus, but never actually stoned Jesus. The way they finally dealt with him was to hand him over to the Roman authorities, and the Roman secular authorities were the ones that actually killed Jesus. They never themselves, under their own religious authority, stoned Jesus. They threatened to stone Jesus' disciples, but never did. But here comes Stephen, the Greek person, who's helping Greek vulnerable widows, and all of a sudden, what he says inflames the crowd, and the crowd stones Stephen. He becomes the first martyr of the church, the one that's helping the other group that speaks a different language and has a different culture. And so a persecution comes, and the persecution drives people from Jerusalem out, and it takes eventually some people to the town of Antioch, and something really interesting happens at Antioch, is that they start bridging across the ethnic lines. See, Jews weren't supposed to eat with Gentiles, or in some sense, do the more sacred parts of worship. And they had to learn to go, we're going to take relationship over religion, we're going to take grace over the law. The gospel speaks, if to anything, to this. And so they learned how to rethink church, that it's one body and we're all equal in that body. But that inflamed people that didn't like how that ethnic kind of approach was being treated. So Paul had to actually write back to the leaders in the church and say, this is the gospel that I'm preaching. This gospel that unites across division. And so I need you guys to give me a mandate and to bless that and to give me that authority. And this letter he writes, or this kind of conversation that gets struck up, where does it happen? Do you guys remember? Anyone? A grad student, maybe? This council, this meeting about Paul's gospel, it happens in Jerusalem. Wait a second. I thought persecution came, so everybody fled Jerusalem. But here, the word is coming back to Peter and James and John, and where are they? They're in Jerusalem. Meaning, as Jewish believers in Jesus, they had enough connections, enough relationships, enough stability that they were able to remain in Jerusalem. And so you see the beginning of this really interesting conversation that we have divisions across ethnic lines, across racial lines, across gender lines, across power or socioeconomic lines, and that some people in the church use those to kind of drive a wedge and to talk at, not with people, and that this gospel that Paul was preaching somehow unites, and that the church in Jerusalem baptized and said, yes, go and preach that gospel. And not only that, but continue to remember the poor. Because if we don't do that, then somehow this gospel loses all its power or all its authority, because somehow we don't truly understand it if we're not connecting it to the plight of our fellow man. We're compartmentalizing it. We're putting it behind glass. We're creating groups called the guardians of the gospel, and we're not actually treating it like this revolutionary, contagious message that it is. So you are in a wonderful position as learners here in Westmont, in Santa Barbara, or if you go to the San Francisco campus, where you can live cheaper in San Francisco than you ever will be able to in your life, and learn in one of the most diverse cities and multicultural cities that you could, what this actually looks like for us to hammer out our faith and the way we live with people with a gospel that speaks to and has something to say, like light, to all of the crazy parts of the world right now and in society. We don't have to live in fear. We don't have to think that we're losing privilege. We don't have to be protective. We have the gospel. We get to live by faith. We have a hope in Jesus. We get to go out with joy, knowing that the message that we not only heard, but we embody is good news to all people. Amen? So whoever God made you to be, whatever shape or size, whatever gender, whether you have freckles, long hair, short hair, whoever you are, God made you that way for a reason so that he could use you for his purposes to be a light in this world. So go in grace and peace. Thank you for having me again, Westmont, and I'll talk to you soon.